I remember the first day I moved into the house. It was a nondescript two-story building on a quiet street, the kind of place you'd walk past without giving a second glance. The rent was cheap, almost too cheap for a house that size, but I didn't question it. I needed a place to stay, and this seemed perfect, too perfect, maybe. The roommates were already settled in when I arrived, their names a blur of handshakes and polite smiles. There was John, the tall, quiet one who seemed to spend most of his time in his room. Lisa, always in the kitchen, cooking something that never quite smelled right. And Karen, who was friendly enough but had a habit of staring just a little too long when you spoke to her. At first, everything seemed normal, or as normal as it could be when you're the new person trying to fit into an established routine. But there was something off, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. It started small, unexplainable noises in the night, like the creaking of floorboards when no one was there, or the faint sound of whispering just beyond the edge of hearing. I told myself it was just the house settling or maybe the pipes, anything but something that could be real. Then there were the odd behaviors from the others. John never seemed to leave his room except at night. I'd hear him moving around at strange hours, pacing the hallway, his steps slow and deliberate. I once caught him just standing at the top of the stairs in the dark, staring down at me as I went to get a glass of water. When I asked him if everything was okay, he just nodded, a little too quickly, and disappeared back into his room. Lisa was always cooking, but I never actually saw her eat anything. She'd be in the kitchen for hours, stirring pots, chopping vegetables, but there were no plates or leftovers, no smells of food being served. Once, I opened the fridge late at night, and it was empty, completely empty. The kitchen counters were spotless, as if nothing had ever been prepared there. And then there was Karen. She was the most normal, I guess, but even she had her moments. She'd ask me the same questions over and over, as if she didn't remember our previous conversations. "How was your day?" she'd say, smiling, but her eyes would be blank, unfocused. Sometimes, when I answered, it felt like she wasn't even listening, just waiting for her turn to speak again. Despite all of this, I tried to convince myself it was just the stress of moving, of adjusting to a new environment. But there was something else, something I couldn't ignore, a constant, nagging feeling of being watched. It wasn't just when I was alone in my room or walking down the hall. It was everywhere, all the time, like the walls themselves had eyes. I brushed it off as paranoia, the kind that creeps in when you're not yet comfortable in a new place. But as the days went on, the feeling only grew stronger, more intense. It was as if the house was alive, breathing, waiting. And every time I caught one of my roommates out of the corner of my eye, I couldn't help but think that there was something lurking just beneath the surface, something not quite human. But I told myself it was all in my head. After all, I just moved in. Surely it was just a matter of getting used to things, right? At least that's what I tried to believe. It wasn't long before the oddities I tried so hard to ignore began to pile up, each one gnawing at my sense of reality. The strangeness that I had brushed off as quirks or misunderstandings began to take on a more sinister shape, a pattern I couldn't unsee once it started to take form. The first thing I noticed was their routines. At first, I admired the discipline. John was always out of his room at precisely 11 p.m., like clockwork. He'd walk down the hall, enter the kitchen, and make a cup of tea, the exact same way every single night. He'd sit at the kitchen table, staring at his mug, not drinking, not even moving, until the tea had gone cold. Then, at midnight sharp, he'd get up, pour the tea down the sink, and return to his room. No deviation, no variation. The precision of it was unsettling. Lisa, too, was a creature of habit. Every morning at 7 a.m., she'd start her cooking. The same chopping sounds, the same rhythm of her movements. And yet, no food ever appeared. Just the sounds of preparation, then nothing. Sometimes I'd linger in the hallway listening. I'd hear her humming. A tune so simple, it seemed almost like a lullaby, repeated endlessly. But if I stepped into the kitchen, she'd stop immediately, turning to me with that same blank smile, like a doll waiting for its next instruction. Karen was the worst, though. She was always there, always asking the same questions, the same way, at the same times. "How was your day?" Did you sleep well? At first, I thought she was just being polite, but after a while, it felt wrong. There was no life behind her eyes, no curiosity, just a mechanical need to fulfill her role. One day, I decided to change things up. When she asked, "Did you sleep well?" I replied with something different. "I didn't sleep at all, actually." She didn't blink, didn't even pause to consider my response. "That's nice," she said, her voice flat, like she hadn't heard me at all. Conversations with them started to feel like I was talking to a broken record. The same lines, the same pauses. Their responses were so perfectly timed, so unnervingly consistent, that it began to feel like they weren't really listening at all, just playing out a script. I'd ask them simple questions, things that would normally lead to a conversation, but they'd answer in ways that were too vague, too rehearsed. And when I tried to push, asking something unexpected, they'd either change the subject or give a response that made no sense, like they couldn't process what I was saying. It got to the point where I started experimenting, asking questions that no one would have a ready answer for. "What do you think about the end of the world?" Or "Do you ever dream?" But their answers were always the same, empty, lifeless, as if they weren't really there, just echoing some pre-programmed response. I started to watch them more closely, looking for cracks in their routines, any sign that they were real people. But the more I observed, the more I began to doubt. There was something too perfect about the way they moved, too precise. They never tripped, never dropped anything, never made a mistake. It was like they weren't capable of it. The doubt gnawed at me, growing into something darker, something that made my skin crawl every time I was around them. I began to wonder if they were even human. The way they moved, the way they spoke, it was all too controlled, too rehearsed. It felt like they were going through the motions of being human without actually being alive. I started to question everything. Were they watching me the way I was watching them? Were they aware of my growing suspicion? Every time one of them looked at me, I felt a chill run down my spine, like they could see right through me, see the fear I was trying so hard to hide. I knew something was wrong, but what? The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that whatever these people were, they weren't real. They were something else, something pretending to be human, and they were getting better at it every day. And the worst part was, I was trapped here with them, surrounded by things that only looked like people, with no idea how to escape. It was the night I found John in the living room that everything started to unravel. I had been up late, unable to sleep, the same nagging sense of dread keeping me restless. I decided to go downstairs, maybe make myself some tea, hoping the routine would calm me. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I froze. John was sitting in the dark, facing the wall. He wasn't watching TV, not reading or doing anything you'd expect. He was just staring. His back was rigid, his hands resting on his knees, completely still. The room was so silent that I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him, waiting for him to move, to acknowledge me. But he didn't. He just kept staring at that blank, empty wall. I don't know how long I stood there, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, I forced myself to speak, my voice shaky. "John, are you okay?" He didn't respond at first. Then, after what felt like minutes, he turned his head, slowly, mechanically, and looked at me. His eyes were empty, devoid of any emotion, any recognition. He blinked once, twice, and then turned back to the wall, resuming his eerie vigil. Something broke inside me then. The small thread of normalcy I had been clinging to snapped, and I retreated back upstairs, locking myself in my room. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the walls closing in around me. That wasn't normal. None of this was normal. The next day, John was gone. His room was empty, bed made, as if he had never been there at all. I asked Lisa and Karen if they had seen him, but they just shrugged, their responses as empty as his stare had been. "He's probably out," Lisa said, stirring something in a pot that smelled like nothing. Karen just smiled at me, that same vacant expression that no longer felt human. But John didn't come back. Not that day, not the next. Then, 2 days later, I saw him again. sitting at the kitchen table like nothing had happened. But something was different. He looked the same, but there was an oddness about him, something that set my nerves on edge. His movements were just a bit too smooth, his voice a little too flat. And when he looked at me, his eyes seemed off. The color, the depth, it was all wrong, like someone had replaced the person I knew with a hollow copy. Panic set in. I knew I had to find out what was going on, what these people really were. I started investigating, going through their things when they weren't around, searching for any clue, any explanation. What I found only deepened my fear. In Lisa's room, I found papers, documents that looked official at first glance but were filled with inconsistencies. Dates didn't match up, signatures were almost identical, and the more I read, the more they felt like poorly crafted forgeries. There were no personal details, no memories captured in these papers. Just a cold, clinical record of someone who didn't seem to exist. Karen's room was no better. Her drawers were filled with photos, but every single one of them was off. In each picture, she wore the same expression, a blank, lifeless stare. The settings changed, the people around her changed, but Karen remained eerily the same in every photo. And the people in the photos with her, they all had that same vacant look. It was as if someone had taken a snapshot of mannequins, posed to mimic real life but failing miserably. I tried searching for them online, desperate for any proof that they were real, that I wasn't losing my mind. But there was nothing. No social media profiles, no digital footprint, not even a mention of their names anywhere. It was as if they had never existed, or worse, as if they had been created from nothing, placed here to play some sick role. The more I uncovered, the more the pieces fell into place. These people, if I could even call them that, weren't human. They couldn't be. Everything about them was too perfect, too controlled. The way they spoke, the way they moved, it was all a facade, a carefully constructed illusion. They were something else, something that only looked human but was devoid of any real life. The realization hit me like a wave of cold terror, flooding my veins with fear. I was living with things that weren't real, surrounded by entities that were pretending to be people. But for what purpose? What did they want from me? And why hadn't I noticed sooner? I could no longer trust anything I saw, anything I heard. Every sound, every movement in the house became a potential threat. I started sleeping with my door locked, my back to the wall, my eyes never fully closing. The house that had once seemed so normal, so safe, had become a prison, and the people in it, whatever they were, had become my captors. I had to get out. But the question was, how? And once I did, would I ever really be safe? After discovering what I had about my roommates, or whatever they were, I could feel my mind starting to fracture. Every day felt like I was walking on the edge of a cliff, one wrong step away from plummeting into madness. I couldn't trust them. I couldn't even trust myself. I began to avoid them as much as possible. I'd wait until the house was silent, until I was sure they were all in their rooms or out, before I'd venture downstairs to grab a quick bite to eat or use the bathroom. I stopped using the kitchen entirely, stockpiling snacks in my room instead. The idea of being in the same space with them, even for a moment, made my skin crawl. My room became both my sanctuary and my prison. I kept the door locked at all times, pushing a chair against it just in case. The windows were shut tight, the curtains drawn, as if that thin layer of fabric could protect me from the horrors outside. I started sleeping during the day, staying awake all night, when the house was at its quietest. But even then, I could hear them moving about, their footsteps unervingly steady, as if they never truly rested. The paranoia was like a parasite, burrowing deeper into my mind with every passing hour. I'd sit at my desk, the glow of my laptop the only light in the room, scouring the internet for anything that could explain what I was living with. I read about government experiments, alien abductions, artificial intelligence, all the crazy theories that I would have dismissed as nonsense just a few weeks ago. But now they all seemed terrifyingly plausible. I started keeping notes, tracking their movements, trying to find any inconsistencies, any signs that they were slipping up. But there were none. They were too perfect, too precise. It was as if they were one step ahead of me, as if they knew what I was doing. And maybe they did. I started to notice things, subtle, chilling things that suggested they were watching me just as closely as I was watching them. It was in the way they knocked on my door at the exact same time every day, asking if I needed anything, always with that same blank smile. Or the way I'd find things in my room slightly out of place, like someone had been inside when I wasn't looking. My clothes, my books, even my bed. Everything would be just a little off, not enough to be obvious, but enough to make me question my sanity. Once I found my laptop open, the screen still on. I was sure I had shut it down before I went to lie down for a few hours. The search history was empty, wiped clean. I could have sworn I'd saved several pages of research, but they were gone, vanished without a trace. Had they been in my room while I was sleeping? The thought made my blood run cold. And then there were the shadows. At night, I'd see them under my door, shapes passing by, pausing just outside, as if listening, waiting. The floorboards would creak, and I'd hold my breath, praying that they'd move on, that they wouldn't try to come in. But the knocking would always come, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. "Are you okay in there?" they'd ask, their voices muffled but unervingly calm. "We're worried about you, worried about me." The words echoed in my head, twisting into something sinister. They weren't worried. They were toying with me, trying to break me down, to make me doubt everything until I had nowhere left to turn. I started talking to myself, whispering just to hear a human voice, to remind myself that I was still sane. I'd mutter theories, plans, anything to keep the silence at bay, but it was no use. The paranoia seeped into every corner of my mind, poisoning my thoughts, my emotions. I could feel myself unraveling, but there was no one to help, no one to save me. I was utterly alone, trapped in that house with those things that only looked like people, and there was no way out. The walls were closing in, the air growing thicker, suffocating. I began to wonder if I'd ever escape, or if this was where I'd lose my mind completely. And then, one night, as I lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling, I realized the horrifying truth. I was a prisoner, not just of the house, but of them. They weren't just observing me. They were controlling me, manipulating me, waiting for the moment when I'd finally break. And I was so close, so dangerously close to that moment. The night it all came to a head, I knew I couldn't stay in that house a moment longer. My nerves were frayed to the breaking point, and my paranoia had twisted into a raw, gnawing terror. The constant surveillance, the subtle manipulations, the way they seemed to anticipate my every move. It was all too much. I had to leave. I had to get out before they could close in on me completely. I waited until the house was silent, until I was certain they were all in their rooms, or at least pretending to be. The clock on my desk ticked over to 3 a.m. The hour felt heavy, like the air was thick with a malevolent presence, waiting for me to make my move. I grabbed my backpack, already packed with essentials, and quietly unlocked my door, praying the old hinges wouldn't betray me. The hallway stretched out before me, darker than I had ever seen it. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon filtering through a window at the end of the corridor. I moved slowly, each step calculated, my breath held tight in my chest. The door to John's room was slightly ajar, but no sound came from within. Lisa's door was shut, and Karen's too. For a moment, I thought I might actually make it. But then, as I reached the top of the stairs, I heard it. A creak, so soft it was almost imperceptible, but enough to send a jolt of fear through my body. I froze, listening, my heart hammering in my ears. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive, and I wondered if it had just been my imagination, if my frayed nerves were playing tricks on me. I took another step, and that's when I heard it again, this time, a soft whispering, like voices murmuring just out of earshot. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably sinister. My pulse quickened, panic setting in. They knew. They had always known. I bolted down the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps, not caring anymore about the noise. I reached the front door and yanked it open, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. Freedom was just a step away. But then, they were there, blocking the doorway, their forms silhouetted against the darkness outside. John, Lisa, Karen, all standing in perfect, eerie stillness. Their faces were expressionless, devoid of any warmth or humanity. It was like staring into the faces of mannequins, lifeless and hollow. "Where do you think you're going?" Karen's voice was calm, almost soothing, but it sent a chill down my spine. Her eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, as if she could see right through me, into the very depths of my fear. "Please," I begged, my voice shaking. "I just want to leave." "You can't leave," Lisa said, stepping forward. Her movements were smooth, too smooth, like a machine. "This is your home now. This is where you belong," John added, his voice a low monotone that seemed to reverberate through the walls. I took a step back, my hands still clutching the doorknob. The world outside seemed so close, yet impossibly far away. I could feel the darkness closing in around me, their presence suffocating, inescapable. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "You're not real. You're not human." For a moment, they just stared at me, their blank eyes unchanging. Then, as if on some unspoken cue, they all smiled. It wasn't a human smile, but something grotesque, a mockery of what a smile should be. Their lips pulled back too far, revealing teeth that were just a bit too sharp, too white. The skin around their mouths stretched unnaturally, like rubber being pulled too tight. "Real?" Karen asked, tilting her head. "What does that even mean?" And then, the truth hit me with a force that nearly knocked the breath out of me. They were never pretending to be human. They had never been human at all. They were something else, something that had only been wearing the guise of humanity like a mask. And I had been living with them, letting them watch me, manipulate me, trap me. I staggered back, my mind reeling, but there was no escape. They stepped closer, their movements synchronized, their smiles widening as if they could sense my terror. My hand slipped from the doorknob, and I fell to the floor, the cold hardwood pressing against my back as I tried to scramble away. "Please," I gasped, my voice breaking. "Just let me go." But they didn't stop. They kept advancing, their eyes locked on mine, those horrifying smiles never faltering. I could feel the walls closing in, the air growing thicker, suffocating. I was trapped, surrounded by these inhuman things that had been masquerading as my roommates, and I had no way out. In a final act of desperation, I lunged toward the window thinking maybe, just maybe, I could break through and escape. But before I could even reach it, they were on me. Cold, unfeeling hands grabbed me, pulling me back, holding me down. I struggled, screamed, but it was useless. They were too strong, too relentless. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was their faces, looming over me, those empty eyes staring into mine as they leaned in closer and closer, until their faces filled my entire vision. And then, there was nothing. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying in my bed. The room was exactly as I had left it, the curtains drawn, the chair still against the door. For a brief, blissful moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But then I heard it, the sound of footsteps outside my door, slow and deliberate. And I knew I wasn't free. I hadn't escaped. I was still in the house, still trapped with them. And as I lay there, paralyzed with fear, I realized the horrifying truth. I might never leave. Even if I managed to escape this house, who's to say the world outside would be any different? Maybe the whole world was filled with them, these things that looked like people but weren't. Maybe there was no escape at all.